Ethics and Society, Making Ethical Arguments, Part 4. Okay, I'm not sure what it means this program starts Wednesday, but I just like the music. Okay, this is part 4, and in part 4 we're going to look at deontological ethical theories in relation to making an argument about banning smoking. Okay, there are two deontological ethical theories that we looked at: divine command theory and Kantian formalism. So we will start with divine command theory. So we have three principles here. The first one is the principle of deontology or duty. This is a principle that all of these deontological theories are going to share. Do what is morally right because it is morally right, regardless of the consequences. A second principle is the principle of God, right? That God is the absolute moral authority, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. And our third theory is the principle of absolute moral authority. And this is the right thing to do is that which the absolute moral authority commands. Right? And we know that our absolute moral authority is God, and that then with the principle of duty, whatever God commands, we should do because that is the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences. Okay, so these are our principles. What are the facts? Well, there's actually a lot of different facts we can look for. We can look for quotes from sacred books about smoking. We can look for quotes from religious leaders, quotes from expert theologians, direct communication from God, right? So if God directly commands you to do something, then that becomes a fact that you can put into your argument. And sometimes you could use historical record, right? If you can show this is what happens when this particular rule is not followed, when societies smoke, this is how God reacts, whether it's a reward or a punishment. And finally, this is the most important fact that a divine command theorist needs to establish, and that's that God exists. And we talked about how hard it is to establish that as true in an argument where you're trying to persuade others, because the existence of God traditionally is based on faith, and something that you believe on faith, you don't have evidence to support it. It's an act of faith, so it becomes very difficult to establish that fact for a divine command theorist. All right, so what happens with these facts and with those principles when it comes to banning smoking? Well, it really depends on what facts you come up with. So, and I've seen it go both ways. So if you find some quotes, perhaps that the body is a temple, right? It houses the Spirit, the Holy Spirit. Then to damage that temple would be sacrilege, right? So that would seem to support banning smoking. On the other hand, I've seen arguments that there's no specific law that's been given in the Bible to not smoke. There's no commandment, thou shalt not smoke. So there's an argument that says that smoking is permitted. Okay, so it can go either way. It depends on your facts. Some complications. One is that there is more than one religion, right? So this is democracy. We're talking about whether or not the right thing to do is to ban smoking. Should one religion decide what people of other religions or no religion should or should not do, right? So here we have a distinction between religious law, which applies to a particular religion, the members of that religion, versus secular law, which is law by the state, which applies to everybody. And so is the divine command theory making an argument for a religious law that would then apply to those who are members of that religion, rather than a secular law which would apply to everybody regardless of their religion or no religion? So that's a complication. Okay, Kantian formalism. And actually, before I jump into Kantian formalism, there was a lot of complaints that the last video did not have a little commercial break, so we will have one right now.
My husband is very selfish. He won't even use his handkerchief. He just coughs and sneezes over everybody. What am I to do?
Reason with him. Try a little persuasion. Be kind to him. If that doesn't work, throw a bucket of cold water over him.
I showed him a handkerchief the other day. First, he dusted the piano with it. Then he polished his shoes. Then he tied up the pears in the garden. What am I to do?
Take a large pepper pot. Sprinkle him freely with it. Then hold the handkerchief close to his face. He'll learn.
When my husband has a cold, he will put his germy handkerchief in with the family wash, instead of letting me boil them first. What am I to do?
He's obviously dangerous. Get him locked up.
Okay, I love the end of that one. Get him locked up, and everyone cheers as he's taken away to the insane asylum. Why? Because he wouldn't use his handkerchief, which is sort of like a temporary face mask when you need it when you sneezed. And we're so far past that point now. We're way past the handkerchief for when you sneeze. We've now got our full-time masks. Okay, so wear them or you might get committed and sent to an asylum. All right, let's get to Kantian formalism. And here we have 4 different principles, or do we just have one? Kant sort of makes the argument that a lot of his principles are just the same principles said in a different way. So we should keep that in mind. That's why I kind of call those bottom 3 the categorical imperative, right? I'm using his language, and then he has different formulas of that categorical imperative, and I'm just calling each formula a principle, and they may be the same principle, just stated differently. Okay, so we talked before about the principle of deontology, do what is morally right because it is morally right, regardless of the consequences. Now, our 3 formulations of the categorical imperative. The first one, the principle of universality, right? The right thing to do is that which, if we turned it into a maxim and then universalized it, there would be no contradictions. And he's talking about contradictions in what we said were the larger sense, logical contradictions, where things stop making sense, and practical contradictions. And we'll talk about that soon, but a practical contradiction is where you tell somebody to do something and it's impossible to do that. Okay, the second formulation, the categorical imperative, the principle of the kingdom of ends. And here we could say that is, it is always wrong to treat another person only as a means to an end. People have value as ends in themselves, right? So we can't just use another person's life. We always have to respect people and value them just as being people, being someone who's rational, who has a will and can choose to be moral. Okay. And that actually leads us into the third formulation, the principle of autonomy. that in order for an action to be morally right, one must exercise their own free will in willing the moral action. So what is that saying? That's saying in order for something to be ethical, you have to have chosen to do it for the right reason, right? You should have willed it because it's the right thing to do, and not because of whatever is going to happen after you do it. Okay, so those are our principles. Let's talk a little bit about facts. All right, and it turns out facts are a little bit problematic for Kant. There's a question of whether or not we need any facts to answer these questions, to see if there are any contradictions. And we do need to determine the essential nature of the activity. What is smoking? Right? We need to know what that is. And we could define smoking as inhaling burnt debris, right? Just a general sort of the most broad definition we could come up of smoking, to try to include all different types of smoking, right? Because sometimes it's a cigarette, sometimes it's a cigar, sometimes it's in a pipe. So in all those cases, you're inhaling burnt debris. But a definition is a principle, right? You're setting up a rule. This is what smoking is. You're not talking any specific instances of smoking. So this is sort of a weak argument for facts. The argument is that, well, maybe we need to observe smoking to come up with that definition. I'm not so sure Kant's going to agree with that, but others might say that, okay, well, facts matter in just establishing definitions. Here's a stronger argument for the need to do some fact-finding when making an argument here in Kantian formalism, and that's those practical constraints, right? There can't be any contradictions either logically or practically. And so in order to find out and make sure that whatever we're telling people to do, that they can do that, we do have to do some research. And I have two things we need to figure out. How much tobacco or marijuana exists in the world right now? And also, how many people exist that are of an age when they can make autonomous, rational decisions, right? That they're rational actors to either smoke or not smoke. So why do we need that information? Well, we need to make sure that there's enough tobacco to go around, that if everybody smokes, they'd be able to smoke that much. And so I'll get into that in a few moments. Let's kind of go one by one these different the different formulations of the categorical imperative and see sort of where they lead us and whether or not we should ban smoking. Let's start with the principle of universality. And so how do we do that? We turn smoking into a maxim. I'm always going to smoke. And then we universalize. Everybody's going to smoke. Now, are there any logical contradictions there if everybody does this? And I don't think there is. If everybody lit up a cigarette and smoked right now, that would make sense. There'd be nothing that would become nonsensical by universalizing the act of smoking. So we can't ban smoking based on this first principle, because it still makes sense logically. But what about practically? Right? If everybody smokes and everybody has to smoke the same amount, there's going to be a certain limit where if people tried to smoke more than that amount and everybody was smoking more than that amount, there would not be enough tobacco for everybody to smoke. So, from the principle of universality, we are going to have a limit on how much people can smoke. There's going to be some fair share. And if you smoke more than that, you're doing something that's morally wrong. So from the first principle, we can't ban smoking, but we can set up limits on how much one should smoke. And we need those facts to figure that out. We need to know how many people there are and how much tobacco there is. We need to divide that together to figure out what the maximum amount and what would be the fair share, where if you went beyond that, you'd have more than your fair share. All right, let's look at the principle of the kingdom of ends. And when we talk about that principle, a big example of trying to use that principle is when we talk about suicide. And Kant is against suicide. He says suicide is morally wrong because it's treating your life as completely a means to some end, right? You're willing to, in suicide, give up your whole life in order to get some end, and that end is usually some sort of relief or an escape. And so Kant says that's morally wrong. You can't just treat someone's life, even your own, just as a means to an end. Here's the thing about smoking. Smoking one cigarette will not kill you. So you're not treating your life just as a means to the end, the pleasures that you might get from smoking. So again, using this principle, we're not going to immediately ban smoking. Now, at some point, if you've been smoking long enough, it's definitely going to kill you, right? At that point, if you continue smoking and smoking is going to kill you, you are trading your life for an end, for whatever pleasure you're getting from feeding that addiction. So Kant's going to argue that at that point, smoking is morally wrong. So when your doctor tells you, if you continue smoking, you're going to die, and it's a certainty, it would be morally wrong at that point to smoke. All right, so we have here not an outright ban, but at some point justification to ban smoking on an individual basis. Okay. The last principle, the principle of autonomy. This is interesting, right? This one said that in order for something to be ethical, someone has to exercise their own free will to choose to take an action or not take that action. Secondhand smoke is usually something that people inhale not by their own free will, not by choice. Right? So causing someone to inhale secondhand smoke would violate that person's autonomy, would violate this principle, and therefore Kant and Kantian formalism would have to conclude that one should not cause secondhand smoke involuntarily. Okay. Next, smoking is addictive, right? And once you become addicted to something, you lose control over your actions, right? You now feel compelled to smoke. And this also would be a violation of your own autonomy. You're giving up your control, your ability to make decisions. You're now being controlled by your addiction. So we now have here, looking at this principle, an argument to conclude that addicted smoking is morally wrong. Okay. So Kantian formalism is complicated, right? We don't have just a yes or a no. If we were going to do a yes or no, it would have to be no, that we can't support an outright ban of smoking. But in getting into these different principles, we find that Kantian formalism does place limits on smoking, right? Smoking more than your fair share is morally wrong. Addicted smoking is morally wrong. So as long as you're not addicted and you smoke, then it would be permissible. But once you became an addict, then you're doing something morally wrong. Terminal smoking, right, when it's going to kill you, is morally wrong. And where is that point? That's hard to say. One cigarette certainly is not going to kill you, but at some point it would be terminal. Perhaps in that case, we also need some factual information. When does it become a certainty that continuing to smoke will kill a person? And then we also have a limit on secondhand smoke, that forcing anyone to breathe in secondhand smoke is morally wrong, based on the principles of Kantian formalism. So Kant would support instituting legal repercussions for anyone violating these limits, right? Because they would have chosen, they're rational actors, they would have chosen to violate that limit, so therefore it would not be wrong to have some sort of punishment for choosing to violate the moral law. But the moral law here is just setting up limits. It's not banning smoking outright. It just sets up various limits on smoking. Okay, one last slide. This is all a little bit of trivia about Kant, Immanuel Kant. And it turns out that Kant was a smoker, and he liked to smoke a pipe, and he smoked one bowl. Right, so he'd pack his tobacco into this bowl and smoke one pipe each day. And there are actually reports that as he got older, he bought bigger and bigger pipes. So was he addicted? Well, he might have been. It seems like he wanted more and more. Did he ever actually smoke more than his fair share? That I don't know. I wonder how big those pipes got at the end. Maybe, maybe not. And a complication. And this has to do with our definition. So we talked about smoking before. And we said inhaling burnt debris. Well, now we have something called vaping, right? And vaping is not really, there's nothing burning there, right? It's vaporizing. And so it raises questions about whether or not that is covered by whatever we determine here. Okay, so we have finished part 4, and now we have part 5 left, and part 5 is going to be about virtue ethics.